Nanette, most everybody knows her, Associate Pastor for Discipleship and Small Group Ministries. She joined Forth on staff in 2015. Seems like she's been here forever, but wow, 2015. And in 2017, she got her current role. She has an interesting bachelor degree in psychology, feminist studies, creative writing, and she has Masters of Theology from Harvard and Masters of Divinity from the Corner. So she also is a moderator of ecumenical and interreligious work group of the Presbytery, and it is one of 6 representatives of the Presbytery in ongoing Jewish-Presbyterian dialogue. So a very interesting background. We're looking very much forward to hearing from her. Let me just pray us in. If you would pray with me. Gracious God, help us to keep an open mind and to learn what you would have us learn about the views and the faith journeys of both the Israelis and the Palestinians. What we say about the conflict matters, and how we talk about it matters. We pray this in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen.
Thank you, Alan, very much for that. Just a couple of updates on my bio. Actually, I'm a very active member of the Ecumenical Interreligious Work Group, but I've completed my term as moderator, so there's now another moderator of that group. So I begin a class like this with fear and trembling because it is a very difficult conflict that's happening. It's a life and death conflict that's going on, and people are very passionate about it. There are a lot of implications about it. I taught a class similar to this in 2018 with Reverend Dirk Ficka, who has sadly passed recently and has joined the Church Triumphant, and I just want to acknowledge him publicly as I begin this. My grief at his loss, too young, and my gratitude to him for his mentorship and for all the interfaith work that we did together. So some of you may recognize a few of the slides, even a few of the videos, especially in this first week, because I'm giving some basic foundational material. So as Alan said, we're talking about how we talk about it and how the words we use have reverberations and strike people in different ways. We say one word and different people hear that same word in completely different ways and see different images in their heads. So we're trying to take a step back and think about that. We will be trying to hear from voices from different perspectives. And then today, week 1, we're going to start with just a basic history of the region. I have a 10-minute video from Vox. It's like hundreds of years of history in 10 minutes. So it's going to go very fast, but it will give us like a foundation to share. And then talk about the multiple narratives of how people talk about the conflict. So our goals for today are to develop a basic shared understanding of some of the history of the region and develop an understanding that we all bring our lenses to our dialogue and we all bring our perspectives, and that affects what we see and how we interpret it. So in particular, we're going to look at how maps tell different stories and how maps are used to tell stories and interpret things. In later weeks, we'll get a little bit more deeply into some Presbyterian dialogues, Presbyterian overtures that our denomination has put forward, what some of the conflicts and controversies have been around those overtures, overtures about divestment, about Jerusalem. There's one coming up this year about anti-Semitism and defining it. It includes a section about how we talk about Israel-Palestine. So we'll touch base on that, some recent controversial communications from our stated clerk from the denomination. So these are in future weeks, and we'll get a little deeper into some testimonies from people from the region. Probably touch a little bit on the idea of apartheid and anti-Semitism based on a recent report from Amnesty International, which used the word apartheid talking about the situation over there. So some controversy that comes from that too. So we'll get into those things in later weeks. So first, why is this so hard to talk about? I'm going to start with a little comedy clip here. It's comedy, but it's emotional. This is from 2014. So let's see if our tech will work here.
Later on in the program, Al Jazeera America correspondent Sue Turton. We're going to talk about the 3 journalists that have been jailed in Egypt. And in fact, we'll start tonight in the Middle East, where Israel...
What? Israel isn't supposed to defend itself?
Oh, yeah, if Mexico bombed Texas, will we exercise
What other
restraint?
country is held to the same standard as Israel?
People that want to destroy her
It's a
terrorism?
4,000-year claim.
It's the only democracy in the Middle East, you turd!
Self-hating Jew?
That was weird. Anyway, what I was saying was last Thursday saw the start of a new ground offensive launched by Israel.
Oh,
the Palestinians have a country! Human Tradition! Tradition!
Holy look, obviously there are many strong opinions on this issue, but just merely mentioning Israel or questioning in any way the effectiveness or humanity of Israel's policies is not the same thing as being pro-Hamas.
So you're against murdered children?
Free Gaza! Free Palestine!
Illegal occupation! The Zionist pig!
You know what? Why don't we just talk about something lighter, like Ukraine?
Yeah, I'm good with that.
Wow, right? Now, this was made in 2014, so Ukraine sounded a lot different when they put that on there at the end of this clip. But Ukraine, as we know, is really intense and hard to talk about now, too. So we got a glimpse of these multiple narratives and how passionate it is, and how sometimes when we talk about it, it gets into making claims and attacks on people's character and judging the people who are saying the things that are different. So we're going to try to step back from that and look at the different angles and try to understand the perspectives. So sometimes we think of this as a 2-narrative story, that there's a Jewish or Israeli version of history and an account of what's happening, and that's often thought of as pro-Israel, or there's an Arab-Palestinian, pro-Palestine narrative. And this can quickly, when we start talking about this being pro-Jewish or pro-Arab rather than pro-Israel or pro-Palestine, we get into a quick territory of blaming Jews throughout the world when we say it's a Jewish issue rather than an Israeli issue. Obviously, Judaism is really important, and this is very important to Jews. So there are Jewish issues. But the actors in this situation are the Israeli government and Israeli military. So when we smush it together, there have been Jews attacked in different parts of the world after Israel has taken a terrible, unjust, horrible action, but a kosher grocery store in the UK then gets attacked, you know? So it's not about Jews everywhere. We're going to talk a lot more about that in the weeks following. Most of us want to be supportive of all the people in the region. We don't necessarily want to be pro one side or the other. We want to be pro people. We want to be pro solution. Just to give you a little bit of context, so you're picturing the region, the Israeli population in 2019 was 74.2% Jewish, 17.8% Muslim. So these are Muslims who are citizens of Israel. They have Israeli passports. We just had a guest speaker on this week at our Wednesday orientation for the music choir trip we're going to take to Israel and Palestine this summer. And it was a Palestinian Israeli, a young Palestinian boy who's here to study. He has an Israeli passport. He was talking about how with this Israeli passport he can travel anywhere in Israel or the territories. But we said, what about Palestinians who aren't Israeli citizens? He said, yeah, no, they can't travel around. They're kind of stuck in either the West Bank or Gaza, and they're not as free to travel around. So, but there are Muslim and Arab citizens of Israel, so we need to keep that in mind. About 2% of the Israeli population is Christian, and 1.6% is Druze, and 4.4 are Samaritans or Baha'i or other faiths. I had to learn what Druze meant. Druze are not Muslim practitioners exactly, but they practice a mix of Shia Muslim Islam and ancient Greek philosophies and Hinduism. So Druze is a slightly different religious tradition. So in the Palestinian territories, they are about 86% Arab, predominantly Sunni Muslim. 13% is Jewish, and that's complicated because some of those are Jewish settlers who've moved into Palestinian territories, and we'll talk about that more. About 1% of the people living in the territories are Christian and others, so technically less than 1% for Christians. But that means 47,000 Christians living in the Palestinian territories right now. Globally, there are nearly 1 million Palestinian Christians. 6 to 7% of the Palestinians throughout the world are Christian Palestinians. But those living in Palestine now, 1% or less are Christian. So when we think about Palestinians, just like when we think about Israelis, we got to think about these complex identities. So, but if we look at a map, and we're going to get deep into maps in this session, we have that Jewish-Israeli majority of 74%, and we tend to talk about that as being Jewish, and the Palestinian Arab majority, Muslim Palestinian majority, and that little minority of Palestinian Christians as well. And we get these two different narratives. So how do we listen to the narratives? First, we're going to get into this brief history overview that I mentioned. So this is going to be a 10-minute video. It's going to go really fast. And at the end, we have a handout for you on that chair right there. Make sure you get a handout if you want one. You can pass them around if you want, and we can put a link to that in the chat box for people who want to download it from Dropbox. But it has links to the videos that I'm showing, and you might want to especially watch this history one later if it would be helpful. But here we go to watch it together here.
One of the biggest myths about the Israel-Palestine conflict is that it's been going on for centuries, all about ancient religious hatreds. In fact, while religion is involved, conflict's mostly about two groups of people who claim the same land, and it really only goes back about a century to the early 1900s. Around then, the region along the eastern Mediterranean we now call Israel-Palestine, been under Ottoman rule for centuries, was religiously diverse, including mostly Muslims and Christians, also a small number of Jews who lived generally in peace. It was changing in two important ways. First, more people in the region were developing a sense of being not just ethnic Arabs, but Palestinians, a distinct national identity. At the same time, not so far away in Europe, more Jews were joining a movement called Zionism, which said that Judaism was not just a religion, but a nationality, one that deserved a nation of its own. And after centuries of persecution, many believed a Jewish state was their only way of safety and saw their historic homeland in the Middle East as their best hope for establishing it. In the first decades of the 20th century, tens of thousands of European Jews moved there. After World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and British and French empires carved up the Middle East, the British taking control of a region it called the British Mandate for Palestine. At first, the British allowed Jewish immigration, but as more Jews arrived, settling into farming communities, tension between Jews and Arabs grew. Both sides committed acts of violence, and by the 1930s, the British began limiting Jewish immigration. In response, Jewish militias formed to fight both the local Arabs and to resist British rule. Then came the Holocaust, leading many more Jews to flee Europe for British Palestine and galvanizing much of the world in support of a Jewish state. In 1947, as sectarian violence between Jews and Arabs there grew, the United Nations approved a plan to divide British Palestine into two separate states. One for Jews, Israel, and one for Arabs, Palestine. The city of Jerusalem, where Jews, Muslims, and Christians all have holy sites, was to become a special international zone. The plan was meant to give Jews a state, to establish Palestinian independence and to end the sectarian violence that the British could no longer control. The Jews accepted the plan and they declared independence as Israel. But Arabs throughout the region saw the UN plan as just more European colonialism trying to steal their land. Many of the Arab states, who had just recently won independence themselves, declared war on Israel in an effort to establish a unified Arab Palestine where all of British Palestine had been. The new state of Israel won the war, but in the process, they pushed well past their borders under the UN plan, taking the western half of Jerusalem and much of the land that was to have been part of Palestine. They also expelled huge numbers of Palestinians from their homes, creating a massive refugee population whose descendants today number about 7 million. At the end of the war, Israel controlled all of the territory except for Gaza, which Egypt controlled, and the West Bank, named because it's west of the Jordan River, which Jordan controlled. This was the beginning of the decades-long Arab-Israeli conflict. During this period, many Jews in Arab-majority countries fled or were expelled, arriving in Israel. Then something happened that transformed the conflict. In 1967, Israel and the neighboring Arab states fought another war. When it ended, Israel had seized the Golan Heights from Syria, the West Bank from Jordan, and both Gaza and the Sinai Peninsula from Egypt. Israel was now occupying the Palestinian territories, including all of Jerusalem and its holy sites. This left Israel responsible for governing the Palestinians, a people it had fought for decades. In 1978, Israel and Egypt signed the US-brokered Camp David Accords. Shortly after that, Israel gave Sinai back to Egypt as part of the peace treaty. At the time, this was hugely controversial in the Arab world. Egyptian President Anwar Sadat was assassinated in part because of outrage against it. But it marked the beginning of the end of the wider Arab-Israeli conflict. Over the next few decades, the other Arab states gradually made peace with Israel, even if they never signed formal peace treaties. But Israel's military was still occupying the Palestinian territories of the West Bank and Gaza, and this is when the conflict became an Israeli-Palestinian struggle. The Palestinian Liberation Organization, which had formed in the 1960s to seek a Palestinian state, fought against Israel, including through acts of terrorism. Initially, the PLO claimed all of what had been British Palestine, meaning it wanted to end the state of Israel entirely. Fighting between Israel and the PLO went on for years, even including a 1982 Israeli invasion of Lebanon to kick the group out of Beirut.
The stillness of the ceasefire in southern Lebanon was shattered today by the sound of guns, bombs, and planes.
The PLO later said it would accept dividing the land between Israel and Palestine, but the conflict continued. As all of this was happening, something dramatic was changing in the Israel-occupied Palestinian territories. Israelis were moving in. These people are called settlers, and they made their homes in the West Bank and Gaza, whether Palestinians wanted them or not. Some moved for religious reasons, some because they want to claim the land for Israel, some just because housing is cheap, often subsidized by the Israeli government. Some settlements are cities with thousands of people, others are small communities deep into the West Bank.
If you've always felt a deep yearning for Jerusalem, now is a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity, not only to stand within its gates, but also to build the home of your dreams there.
Settlers are followed by soldiers to guard them, and the growing settlements force Palestinians off of their land and divide communities. Short-term, they make the occupation much more painful for Palestinians. Long-term, by dividing up Palestinian land, they make it much more difficult for the Palestinians to ever have an independent state. Today, there are several 100,000 settlers in occupied territory, even though the international community considers them illegal. By the late 1980s, Palestinian frustration exploded into the Intifada, which is the Arabic word for uprising. It began with mostly protests and boycotts, but soon became violent. Israel responded with heavy force. A couple hundred Israelis, over 1,000 Palestinians died in the First Intifada. Around the same time, a group of Palestinians in Gaza who considered the PLO too secular, too compromise-minded, created Hamas, a violent extremist group dedicated to Israel's destruction. By the early 1990s, it's clear that Israelis and Palestinians have to make peace. The leaders from both sides signed the Oslo Accords. This is meant to be the big first step toward Israel maybe someday withdrawing from the Palestinian territories and allowing an independent Palestine. The Oslo Accords established the Palestinian Authority, allowing Palestinians a little bit of freedom to govern themselves in certain areas. Hardliners on both sides opposed the Oslo Accords. Members of Hamas launched suicide bombings to try to sabotage the process. The Israeli right protests peace talks with ralliers calling Prime Minister Yitzhak Rabin a traitor and a Nazi. Not long after Rabin signs the second round of Oslo Accords, a far-right Israeli shoots him to death in Tel Aviv. This violence showed how extremists on both sides can use violence to derail peace, keep a permanent conflict going as they seek the other side's total destruction. That's a dynamic that's been around ever since. Negotiations meant to hammer out the final details on peace drag on for years, and a big Camp David summit in 2000 comes up empty. Palestinians come to believe peace isn't coming, rise up in a second intifada, this one much more violent than the first. By the time it wound down a few years later, about 1,000 Israelis and 3,200 Palestinians had died. The second intifada really changes the conflict. Israelis become much more skeptical that Palestinians will ever accept peace or that it's even worth trying. Israeli politics shift right, the country builds walls and checkpoints to control Palestinians' movements. They're not really trying to solve the conflict anymore, just manage it. The Palestinians are left feeling like negotiating didn't work and violence didn't work, and that they're stuck under an ever-growing occupation with no future as a people. That year, Israel withdraws from Gaza. Hamas gains power, but splits from the Palestinian Authority in a short civil war, dividing Gaza from the West Bank. Israel puts Gaza under a suffocating blockade, and unemployment rises to 40%. This is the state of the conflict as we know it today. It's relatively new, and it's unbearable for Palestinians. In the West Bank, more and more settlements are smothering Palestinians, often respond with protests and sometimes with violence, though most just want normal lives. In Gaza, Hamas and other violent groups have periodic wars with Israel. The fighting overwhelmingly kills Palestinians, including lots of civilians. In Israel itself, most people have become apathetic. For the most part, the occupation keeps the conflict relatively removed from their daily lives, with moments of brief but horrible violence. There's little political will for peace. No one really knows where the conflict goes from here. Maybe a third intifada, maybe the Palestinian Authority collapses. But everyone agrees that things as they are now can't last much longer. Israel's occupation of the Palestinians is too unstable to last, and that unless something dramatic changes, whatever comes next will be much worse.
So, a lot of information, right? I hope that's helpful, though. It helped me kind of sort out my ideas and get some big pictures of some of the forces and factors coming together in the conflict. I'm going to pull out just a few slides from that and talk about them to emphasize a couple of points and to help us process some of that information. So this was a slide in the video that talked about Israeli settlers in the occupied territory. Several 100,000, they said, even though the international community considers them illegal. And we'll be talking about that a little bit more deeply. So there's lots of problems with the settler movement in the occupied territories. They are illegal. They also include illegal home demolitions of Palestinians. Israelis are taking over this territory that's supposed to be the territory for the Palestinian state. But for context, I also want to look at some other migration in the area. The video also showed this picture of Jews who were fleeing the Arab nations after the 1948 war, or they were either expelled or chose to immigrate to Israel. Scholars talk about push and pull factors. There might have been a pull for some migrants to go to Israel, to have a more secure homeland for themselves. There might have been push factors in some cases. They were expelled from the Arab countries around there. So here's a chart of the movement from 1948 to 2005. That column on the far right is 2005, and it shows 0 under Algeria. That's covered up on our big screen here in the room. So in 1948, these Jews in all these surrounding Arab countries massively immigrating to Israel and leaving the territories. So approximately 50% of the Israelis are Jews from Arab lands, or the descendants of Jews who came there from Arab lands. So were they refugees, or were they willing immigrants? And that's one of the questions, and that's a little contested. There are academic papers written about that, studying the Jewish migration from Iraq, and what were the push factors and what were the pull factors, or different countries. So there's studies written about that. Actually, Wikipedia has a series of articles on their series title is called Jewish Exodus from Arab and Muslim Countries. So checked some of these figures there on Wikipedia, but that's a place where they have several articles about this phenomenon. Another thing they talked about is how extremists on both sides seek the other side's total destruction. And that creates quite an experience of fear. And in this dual narrative, there are some people on each side who say, hey, all we want is peace. If the other side would stop doing whatever they're doing, whichever thing, and they'll name the thing, then we would be able to have peace. But the thing is, there's not just the people who want the peace. There's also the extremists on both sides who trigger the people on the other sides. And feelings in the region have changed because of some of the violence that has triggered people throughout the course of this. So in our local Chicago dialogue between Presbyterians and Jews, the Jewish Federation, we learned early on that sometimes when we say a word, we see different pictures. So when we say the word Palestinian, what do you picture? Do you picture a poor farmer trying to harvest the olives from their olive tree, or a Palestinian woman trying to get to the hospital to have a baby who can't get through the checkpoints? Or do you see a person with a terrorist, basically, who's going to get onto a bus and blow the bus up? So when we talk, we see different things, and so we have to try to find ways to tease that out. So I want to get into maps a little bit and talk about how maps tell stories. This is a kind of famous series of maps. I was watching what's his name? Rick Steves, a PBS guy who does touring and travel, and in one of his videos about Israel-Palestine, you see this map posted there. And so what story are these maps telling? I'm zooming in here a little bit to make it bigger here. So this is titled Palestinian Loss of Land 1947 to Present. So this is the story it's trying to tell. In the first one, you see the white areas are labeled Jewish settlements, and the green areas are labeled Palestinian land, 1947. The partition plan in 1947 was for the second one. We saw that in the video, where parts of this would become the nation state of Israel. The white areas and the green would become a Palestinian state. In 1949 through 1967 is the third slide, and this we saw in the video too. Through wars, when Israel was attacked and other wars, and they fought back, they claimed more land. And so we see the Israeli land growing. And then the last one, it says present. I'm not sure what year present was, but I think it was 10 years ago at least. And it's showing how increasing Jewish settlements, which we also saw in the video, are making more and more of that Palestinian section into basically Israeli space. And the Israeli government subsidizing homes, not giving permits to Palestinians to build their own homes, or illegally knocking down some of their homes. That's a real problem. And this is part of the story of the region. It's also meant to convey Israeli aggression, I think, and it implies that Palestinian-owned and controlled land is lost to Israeli control. So the questions I want to ask about these maps and all our maps is who owns the land, who controls the land, who's at risk in the land, and who's at fault. A lot of times we get stuck in this blame game of, well, we did this because you did that, but we did that because you did that. This map shows Palestinians at risk and Israelis at fault. It shows a land grab. And again, there is some truth in these maps, and we need to understand that and recognize that. But I'm zooming in on another version of the same map. This is the UN partition plan. I think this was the second screen in the metaphor. This is 1947. So it's true that there were Palestinians living on the land, but it's a little misleading to say that it was Palestinian-controlled land. So Gaza was controlled by Egypt, which is completely adjacent to Gaza. And the West Bank, called the West Bank because the Jordan River is the border. So this is the land west of the Jordan River. So that's why it's called the West Bank. That's controlled by Jordan. So there's no Palestinian control. There is Arab control. There's no Palestinian nation to control it or to govern it. And it raises the question for me, like, what's the culpability and the responsibility for Egypt in this map? Or the culpability and responsibility for Jordan in this map, and how they're going to be relating to Israel? It's not just the Israelis dominating the Palestinians. There's these other Arab nations, too, that are part of the story. So, not Palestine yet, not Palestinian controlled. So, here's another set of maps that tell another piece of the story. Again, the partition plan in the first block, and then the second one, the 5 Arab nations joined together in 1948, and all 5 of them attack Israel, trying to remove Israel and have only Arab land there. That was in June, and then in July, the Israeli army in the third screen fights back, and that's when they claim those larger portions of land. So Israel was, in this case, protecting the land that was theirs, and they took military control of other land. Now, how do we feel about countries taking military control of other lands? How do we feel about Russia moving into Ukraine? I mean, there's not like a good guy, bad guy here. But there's global forces fighting for land and resources and for a space to have their identity. How are we going to deal with that? How are we going to think about that? I see a question or a disagreement.
I question the notion of global forces.
Oh, I was comparing like Ukraine and Russia.
I thought you were talking about 1948.
No, I wasn't saying that this skirmish was a global thing. I was saying throughout the globe, people make military actions and take land, and we don't necessarily feel good about that. I'm not saying, hey, good for Israel for winning this in the war, but I'm saying they won it in the war, and we have to use those eyes when we're analyzing it. And so we ask the same questions, like who owns the land, who controls it, who's at risk, who's at fault? I think we see Israel at risk here. Are they then at fault for fighting back and taking that other land? Are these other nations at fault? The blame game doesn't really get us to a solution of the conflict because it just keeps going. It depends on when you start saying who's at blame and why do things happen. There's not a clear good guy, bad guy here. So here's a different map that we also saw in the video that tells a different story about how Israel took the Sinai Peninsula and the Golan Heights and then gave that back in exchange for peace with Egypt. So after the War of 1967, now this is not the complete story either. But it's an important part of the story that Israel was willing to give up land in exchange for peace. So we ask, when we look at maps, is the story this series of maps is telling, is it true? And is this story complete? And this is going to affect how we talk about the conflict in the region, whether or not we're saying we're holding in mind all the forces at play. So for those of us who are not residents of the Middle East, I think we have to ask ourselves, how are we going to act and react and interact with each other, with our friends and neighbors in the region over there? What are we called to do in response to this? We have this history, the wars in 1948, 1967, Intifada's uprising in 1987 and 2000. Sometimes people say, why can't we just get past history? Just let it go. But this is part of the story and part of the complexity that we have to deal with and understand when we're talking with our partners who are engaged in the region. So I want to show you some excerpts, just about 4 minutes, from a video from a TEDx talk that was given in Jerusalem. I think the year shows up in the opening of it. There's just 4 minutes of excerpts from Ali Abu Awad. Ali Abu Awad was a Palestinian activist, is a Palestinian activist. He was raised in a very active Palestinian activist family. His mom was involved with Fatah. He and his mom were both imprisoned by the Israeli military for years of their lives, I think 4 years for him. And so this 10-minute full TED Talk, I didn't know how our time was going to go, I could have showed the whole thing, but you'll have the link and you can watch the whole thing. In this clip, he tells a story of something that changed his perspective radically. That's all I'll say about that part, because he'll tell his own story. But about who he is, he works with an organization called Family Circle. Sometimes he calls it bereaved parents, bereaved families, but I think it's called Family Circle. There's a podcast at On Being with Krista Tippett where she interviews him and a Jewish mother who work in the same organization, and they've both lost family members in the conflict, and so that'd be worth listening to with Krista Tippett as well. Ali Abu Awad also works with a Jewish settler who lives near his home, and he has his family's Palestinian land, and this Rabbi Hanan Schlesinger has worked with Ali Abu Awad to create an organization called Roots, where they are trying to humanize each other and understand each other's perspectives. And we're going to hear a little bit more of their process and their testimony in some future weeks. So let's watch 4 minutes from Ali Abu Awad, and then we'll have some discussion time.
Finally, the second intifada has started as a consequence of these acts, and I was badly wounded by a settler, and my brother was very violently murdered by Israeli soldiers in my village, Beit Umar, next to Hebron. So what do? When this happens to you, you are not the same person. It's not the same life. These are not the same enemies. And I was having this conflict between my non-violence mind, political mind, and my heart, which was bleeding. Then you think, how many Israelis shall I kill to heal this pain? How many Israeli mothers has to cry to experience the salty taste of my mother's tears? And how many numbers of dead people, and how many graves has to swallow Israeli bodies to tell Israel that my brother was not deserved to die? Then I couldn't do anything. Thinking about revenge is easy, which is normal. But whatever I do, he's not gonna come back. There is no limited number for revenge. This punishment that you think about as a victim cannot lead you to any future. So I was stuck until I met a group of bereaved Israeli families where I realized that there is another face of Israel. Israel successfully shows me Air Force, tanks, checkpoints, aggressive behaviors. But it took Israel 32 years of my life to show me a Jewish tears. I couldn't imagine that Jewish people have tears or feeling. Then suddenly, you see a victim. Then you realize that you are not the only victim. Then my whole world has changed. I become an activist for nonviolence and reconciliation. And I realize that my real enemy is not the Jewish people. It's their fear. The fear of the Jews are our biggest enemy. And the daily suffering of the Palestinian under a military occupation is the best enemy for Israel. We are creating a Palestinian nonviolence national movement to build an identity for ourselves, because nonviolence for me is the art of being a human being. It's the celebration. It's the celebration of my existence. The one who murdered my brother this way, he wanted to bury my humanity in the same grave. But I say, no, I'm not a victim anymore. Why? Not because I don't have pain, not because I can erase all the path and the catastrophe and the disasters in my life, but because I belong. And I know how to serve this belonging. I am the truth. If Jewish people has a truth here, we also have a truth here. So peace is a place where two truths can fit together in one place.
So that's our excerpt for today. Abu Awad has written a book called Painful Hope. This talk is called Painful Hope, 10 minutes on TED Talks, TEDx Jerusalem. And I bring this to you today to just talk about how there are many people working for peace in many places, here and there. And for us who don't live there, we have to think, I sort of said this already, think about what we're called to do. We're not going to solve the conflict. We're not going to save the people in Israel and Palestine. We're not the saviors. But we want to be faithful citizens. We want to be faithful followers of God in the way of Jesus and do what's right. So there have been many Presbyterian dialogues, many Presbyterian overtures, and we'll be talking about those in more detail later. I didn't want to, you can only accomplish so much in 1 hour, but we will be talking about those things that I mentioned at the beginning, going into some of the history of that and talk about the claim that the situation there now has become an apartheid situation, and how do we talk about that and think about that. So I'm going to stop sharing now, and we have about 12 minutes or so for conversation, questions. I would love to hear, what you were hoping to get out of this class, or what you hope that we'll be sure to cover in the future 2 weeks, or questions you have about any of the material that came up today. Any? Yeah, go ahead.
Yes, I have a question about what happened after World War I, and when the British, Palestinian, and the protectorates were set up and the Middle East divided. I guess my understanding of life under the Turkish for 900 years was there were no boundaries, there were no countries. That was the caliphate, and Turkey, took the good people, sent them to school, and whatever they do, but they joined the Germans and the Austrians in World War I and lost, and of course lost the empire, and the British and the French and the Versailles divided things up, and the Turks, as I understand it, sent 500,000 Greeks home, including Jews and everybody else, and established Turkey with different lines that I guess than the Allies set up for them. And there was a second treaty that established peace in the Middle East after Versailles, and that's what established the first map.
The British Mandate.
Yeah, and I think gave the people who lived in the Palestine area this name of Palestinians, when before, I don't know what they were. What the Turks called them, but there were Jews there were Arabs there, Druze, as we know, right? And then the Western created these territories, it seemed, right? And then I don't know what happened between 1923 and 1948 or 47 when the UN said, well, this will be the way it is.
Right.
And that's where it all sort of started, it seems to me. And then apparently, and of course we know the Jews were obliterated in Europe, and so the ones that were left wanted to get out. Again, supported by the Zionists. And I think there was something called the Balfour Declaration in between the war, which I don't know, I think it said the Jews should get a homeland or something. And they endorsed the whole Zionist idea, I believe.
Okay. Well, you're giving a good answer to your own question about what happened.
The 1947 map was there. The local Arabs didn't like it, declared war. They lost the war. And, the winner kind of has the say. And the UN didn't say anything about the Israelis were doing something wrong. To me, that's sort of where it all starts, I guess.
Well, thank you for that. I want to check with the people on Zoom. Are you able to hear the people in the room speaking?
Yeah, Blake, could you come on
Okay.
to the room?
Great. Blake.
You need to unmute.
We can hear you. We hear you.
Okay, thank you, Ken. Go ahead, Blake.
Hamas is supported by Iran, and that adds a whole new element to the parties that are involved, because Iran's stated purpose is to obliterate Israel, no peace or anything. Did you see anything that indicated the impact that Iran is having on the day-to-day life there in the the Israeli-Palestinian state?
I have not studied that, so we're going to push right up against the edges of my knowledge, because I am not a historian or even a politician. So I appreciate what you're bringing into the space about some of the history that you know, and that question and the point about Iran's role, that it is a role. Go ahead. Do you have something related?
I just didn't experience. I got screamed at real bad a number of years ago, and it started off as a nice conversation with two very long-term, a little bit older than I am, Jewish friends in New York. And I said, it seems that, hey, you don't shoot rockets and you don't build houses in other people's backyards, and that's the way it should work out. And I got screamed at, that's our land. God gave us that land. Which he went right back to Moses, not the church, but way back.
Great
So
question.
there's that attitude that exists, and how do you get around it?
Yeah, we will have to talk about the Bible and the relationship of biblical claims of the land here, and the sense of both people's feeling rooted in the land. I'm going to try to talk about each of their sense of being rooted. And there's a diversity of opinion about what that biblical thing means. And some people claim that as meaning about this literal land. And yeah, we will talk about the Bible more. Good question. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and the whole.
Trying to get in.
Okay, we'll go to Ken and then we'll come back to you. Ken.
I just want to first say thanks for this, for doing this. Very timely for us. And you asked the question, one of the questions you asked was, what are we expected to get out of this? Why are we here? You know, like many of us, I have a great many Jewish friends, and I'm involved with them on a number of different levels, both interfaith, but just friendships as well. And so I hear from them their belief of ownership of the land. But inside of me, maybe this is cultural, but inside of me, I have some very strong emotions about seeing situations or knowing situations that it may not be exactly this, but appear in my head and in my emotion to be similar to the things I've seen. What comes to mind are things like the Native American Indians and how they were pushed out over time to a point that they no longer have a place here, or a very small place in America, and have been damaged greatly in that way. I think about South Africa and the Dutch and all that has happened there. And so I have some very strong emotions that come out, and maybe those aren't the right feelings to feel about this. So I hope to learn more in this class so that I can adjust my feelings and be able to talk in a careful and respectful way to my friends who may be Jewish, and some, by the way, are Muslim, and they have very strong feelings as well.
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you, Ken. I think that is a key part of why we're here, to talk about how to talk about it, how to manage all the feelings that we have about it. It doesn't escape me what's happening in our own country with the strong separation and how hard it is for many of us to be at a Thanksgiving dinner table about issues about our own country. And we have a hard time talking to people who are different from us. We've become more and more polarized in our own country. And I think there's a polarization about this as well. And so there may be some learnings that we can take in both directions about how do we deal with it when people feel very passionate about their perspective. How do we deal with polarization? So we'll talk about that a little bit too. I said you could go next.
A continuing problem they have is that the Arabs have a lot more kids than the Israelis as a whole, so these areas just keep getting more and more crowded. And on the other side, Israel wants any Jew in the world to be able to move there if they want, because they can be persecuted someplace else or whatever. So you've got a little plot of land there, and it's getting way too crowded.
Yes, yes, and the population growth of the Palestinian community is a factor when thinking about how do you maintain a Jewish nature. There's a different word for it, like a Jewish nature, I'll remember that word next week, but a character, like a Jewish character of a democracy. How do you have a democracy that's really democratic, but keeps a Jewish character when the Palestinian population is growing so much? That is one of the problems, one of the issues. Yes, I'll go to Jamie next.
I'm showing my ignorance, but at what point did the United States get involved with the negotiation? Was it in 47 at that initial point, or has it just evolved later on where we've been brought in to negotiate peace and so forth in an area that doesn't seem like it's in our backyard?
Yeah, I don't know if we were involved in the British mandate. I don't see us mentioned there. I think we came in later. Do you have the answer?
But what we did, the reason that if there's one person that the Palestinians detest, it's Truman, because he agreed to recognize them at the UN. You know, the UN recognized Israel in 48, and then that war started, you know, et cetera. But that was the turning point.
Okay, so
for recognizing Israel as a country.
Okay.
And is that how, through the UN, is how the United States got more
I think there was a
actively
vote
involved?
in the UN, and we agreed. We voted to recognize because Truman went against the advice of his foreign minister and took the advice of his domestic minister. In effect, I forgot their names, but everybody said, "What the heck are you doing?" You know.
Okay. Were you going to say something else?
Well, initially, the United States, Britain and France wanted it to be a three-part mandate, but when the British and the French took over or got into the mandate, the United States at that time said, we don't want anything to do with it. So initially, we were not part of the, maybe we were not part of the solution, as it turns out today, who knows. But
Okay, thank you. Marilyn.
How does a Palestinian qualify for Israeli citizenship?
They live in Israel land. And, so our guest this week said that when the wars happened, his family did not leave, and they were living in the Israeli portion of the map, and they just stayed there. And so they became Israeli citizens. Yes?
The Palestinians that are Israeli citizens, or the Muslims, whatever, the counterpart, that are citizens of Israel, are not treated as citizens, equally treated as citizens. And I think one of the myths that we hear time and time again by our American politicians is that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. I think I could present a lot of data to say, no, Israel is not a democracy. It's a democracy for the Jews who live in Israel. It's not a democracy for the Israelis, and I have personally witnessed through 5 various travels in the Middle East, including the refugee camps in Jordan, Syria, etc., that many examples of how citizens of Israel were treated quite discriminated against by the Israeli military, etc.
Yes, absolutely.
So I think that's a myth when we hear time and again that Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. Israel is not a democracy.
Okay, I hear you that there is discrimination and there's not equal rights, and I agree with that. That's absolutely true. I wouldn't go so far to say that means that's not a democracy. I think we have discrimination and a lack of equal rights in our country too, but I still want to call us a democracy. So that's where we would be.
To the extent that you discriminate against any citizen, it's not a democracy.
I hear your definition. Yes. Well, right. It challenges the tenets of our democracy. It should not be the case. All right, well, I think that's it. Just remember, next week's class will start late because of the congregational meeting, so it'll probably be more like 11:25-ish. Folks on Zoom, remember, don't give up if we're not there when you log on. We'll be here shortly.
And you are to be commended for taking this on.
It's a tough issue. Thank you. Thank you. We're going to work on it together. I'm grateful for all of you for showing up and being part of the conversation. See you again next week. Bye-bye.